if you're looking at the issue of industrialization and the competition that you're looking at, because first and foremost, if you look at we have various industries within Africa, and there are various strong points. If you're looking at the various members of the AfCFTA, for instance, if you take manufacturing, you find that South Africa has an edge over manufacturing of certain goods. If you go to Uganda, maybe Ghana and Rwanda, you find that they have the aspect of the motor vehicle. If you go to Ethiopia, you have the aviation industry and stuff like that. So we need to leverage on that and work, first of all, on the internal market. And then it also gives a bigger scope in terms of specialization that we are able to compete with the other competitors from China. It would actually be very nice if we sat down and noticed that most of the things that we're using in Africa are actually originating from Africa. I always joke around with my students and I tell them, if someone told you to go and buy a car that was manufactured in Ghana, why wouldn't you buy it? It's because of the whole issue of branding. So we need to build our brands, and that is basically something that we're going to be looking at IP. So we have the capacity. So we need to create the competition within so that we are able to move on and compete outside.
I would like to see more discussions on how do we finance this at the continental level. I was looking at the recent AU audit reports, and it seemed peace and security is now really taking up a huge percentage of the budget. So that leaves a lot of the programming that is across the continent being funded by partners. So if we're going to really tackle making trade work for development with the AfCFTA as the driver of that inclusion, perhaps the continental financing infrastructure needs to be looked at. And so I would like to put that as a question for thinking. I was looking at some numbers, there's a growing African middle class, over 300 million African middle class with a purchasing power of 2.5 trillion. We also have a diaspora that is remittance into Africa that is going at a much higher rate than ODA. What role can the African Development Bank and Afro-Exim Bank play in looking at those opportunities and say, let's work backwards? How do we finance trade for development? How do we support the AfCFTA so that if you just tackle one thing, for example, cross-border trade issues, non-tariff barriers, custom officers, using technology to streamline the process of trading across the border, that is a huge incentive for formalization. What needs to be done, and what is the financing architecture that needs to be put in place? Can the AFDB raise a diaspora bond to fund investment for cross-border trade improvement? Can the Afro-Exim Bank raise a special bond that is funded through maybe new value-added tax regimes to promote industrialization across regional value chains? Some food for thought. So this is what bothers me. This is what I think about a lot when I think about trade, because, I can say in the 5 years I served as minister, I did all the policy, I did all the strategies, I did my best to manage the interests across national, regional, and international to attract the right partners. At the end of the day, we just didn't have the capacity to fully implement the way we had hoped we could implement. Now, it's good to have colleagues like Judah you can work with and talk to and say, look, it's important that we look at the return on the investment if you're building a road in a particular corridor. But if you build a road in a particular corridor and the people along that corridor remain just as poor as they were when before you build the road, then trade hasn't worked as we hope it should. So just food for thought.
You have women that will decide to, are in a village that grows groundnuts. They decide they'll put their land together, they will grow at a scale, then they put themselves together, start grinding that by hand, put their monies together, buy a machine, build a small factory. And I'm thinking, can we consider perhaps the one village, one product model to start with? Because all the Africans who have come before us, our grandparents, were self-enterprising and self-starting. So if we think about the one village, one product, in addition to the big companies that are established and ready, I think we bring the AfCFTA to the individual level to where people can understand, wait a minute, I could be part of this thing. I could sell my peanut butter to 1.4 billion people. Okay, I may not reach 1.4 billion, but at least I can start with ESC that has 200 million plus, right? And as I I listen, I'm thinking, when we quote trade numbers, can we start saying intra-African trade is over 50%? And that includes the 18% that everybody counts through the banks, but it also includes the millions that have been trading for centuries at land borders. This is a great opportunity to find those data points that would allow us to discover the reality and the huge opportunity in the popular sector that we even like to call informal. It is the popular sector. And instead of calling it the bottom of the pyramid, we start calling it the dominant sector because they dominate and we're just not serving them. How do we meet them where they are, innovate around what they're already innovating around, bring value to it, add value to it, take it from the village all the way to supermarkets in the country, all the way to across this One Africa market.
Really, if we're to be inclusive, then we have to think about the last mile as well. And I think her starting point was you look at the woman in the shop, the mama mboga on the street selling her greens. How do you include her in the AfCFTA? That's not to say that the AfCFTA is only for women in that situation. Of course, there are women who own companies, big companies, exporting companies. So how can they also better be placed to benefit from the AfCFTA? I think there are a number of initiatives. Some regional economic communities, they have a SADC Women's Business Council, for example. They try at the regional level to empower women. But also within, I see, for example, She Trades with the ITC. There is her AfCFTA. There are a number of these initiatives that are being run that are not just necessarily focused on the informal trade, but also women who are looking to export in terms of market access information, also just empowering them financially, networks, associations. So it's not just about the informal sector.
I think the challenge that we have is to try and get that common goal. So there is a sense at one level, the ideal level of the SCFTA and the continental market as a common goal. But ultimately, if there's a firm producing, if somebody's producing cashew nuts in West Africa, ultimately their decision about who they sell to for the next processing level is going to be about price. So do they sell it next door because that would then lead to more value added in the continent? Or do they sell it to the Indian investor because they offer a higher price? One leads to more value added in the continent, the other one beyond. But for the company producing, in a way that is neither here nor there almost, they want the best price. And I think the idea then is to try and see is coordination, and some work is happening around specific regional value chains and these kind of platforms to try and work with firms from different regions and countries to say, what would it take to get some kind of coordination and lower the cost to trading between yourselves beyond the tariffs that would lead to some of these things.
Most large manufacturing firms, they're using what is called a China plus 10 strategy. So you're doing China, but you're doing something else to make value chains more resilient. How can the AfCFTA be positioned so that we benefit from that? The U.S. ambassador to Kenya has been pushing Kenya, right? Everywhere she goes, she's pitching Kenya as the next place. That just shouldn't be a Kenya thing. It should be an Africa AfCFTA thing. And so the goal for us is, how can we pivot using the geopolitical circumstances? And as Chinese firms are losing access to American, European markets, they're looking to invest elsewhere. Most of them are going to Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam, but why not Africa? Why not here? And so I think there is an opportunity here. And this year, at least here in the United States, or next year when AGOA is reauthorized, that should also, by coordinating that with AfCFTA, as some US members of Congress are trying to do, that should put us in a better position too. However, I wanted to end this by just describing, again, going back to say, who has what we want? What are we looking for? And think about India again. India now has 149 airports. That's double the number from a decade ago. They're adding 10,000 kilometers of road and 15 gigawatts of solar power capacity per year. Some of the infrastructure that India has is intangible. We're talking digital payments, modern capital markets, banks, a unified digital tax system. I think it's important for us to imagine what we're trying to achieve in Africa and the challenge of being able to do that. And that's why we're having this conversation. That's why we want to do this. And all of the things that have been brought up here today are important. I think to Lucy's point, we should definitely pay attention to what constitutes the base of trading and commerce in Africa, but also to Bruce's point, these firms stopping at a 9% firm, we want more than that. And so how can we combine the two so that there's benefit from the top, the big firms, to the small ones.
We need our own narrative. This is extremely important in terms of statistics, how much we trade, or even framing the issues. For instance, are women engaged in large-scale trade? Yes. Actually, under the Guided Trade Initiative, the shipment from Rwanda to Ghana of Nigeria coffee was by a woman, really. And then the Exide batteries from Kenya to Ghana, though that happened slightly earlier, a huge consignment. The importer in Ghana was a woman as well. Yes. So I think that was actually a very important observation.